Hello, I'm Dr. Simone Silva. I'm a functional medicine doctor practicing in Cape Town, and I have a very special interest in hormonal health and wellness. So I really feel like it's important to have the conversation about stress. We hear the word all the time, we know that it's bad for us, but most of us don't really understand why, what's happening in the body, and what to do about it either. So let's start with what happens when we have stress, what a normal response is, and then what an abnormal stress response would look like, and how that would impact our health and well-being. So a normal stress response really involves something in medicine that we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Very long word. We call it HPA for short. And all it really is talking about is this connection between the brain and the adrenal glands, where all your stress hormones are made. So when we're exposed to a stress, for example, it could be a lion coming to eat us, the brain recognizes the threat and then says to the adrenals, we've got some danger coming, please make some cortisol for me, which is like your first responder hormone or kind of like an ambulance hormone. So your adrenal glands pump out the cortisol. The job of cortisol is to get the body ready to fight or flight so that we can survive the tiger or survive the stress. And it does so by elevating blood sugar levels. So we've got fuel to fight, and it elevates blood pressure. So we can oxygenate the brain, make quick life-saving decisions, oxygenate our muscles, run fast. So the normal stress response in the short term is a really healthy response. It's a really good response. It's life-saving, and we do need it. But we need it in short bursts. The problem starts to come in when the stress response becomes a long-term, unremitting, chronically engaged response. It's like being on high alert all the time. And it starts to become a little bit inappropriate. So for example, if we cut our hand, we wouldn't necessarily want 10 ambulances to arrive at the scene. We would maybe just need a plaster and a nurse. But when we're chronically stressed, we overproducing stress hormones all the time, and there's a hyped up response. So chronic or long-term or unremitting stress patterns go through stages, and you might be able to recognize yourself in one of these stages. In the early stages, the brain and the adrenal glands feel like they're on high alert all the time, and there's an overproduction of cortisol. Like we said, all these ambulances arriving at the scene. And in that space, we often feel quite wired, quite anxious. But because it's also quite a lot of work for the body to be pumping out all this cortisol, we do start to get tired. So if we're in this particular part of the stress response, we may feel wired and tired. We may feel like we're developing foggy thinking or having memory changes. And we may also start to see changes in our immune systems, because there's an incredible link between hormones, particularly stress hormones, and the immune system. So high cortisol levels can impair the body's ability to fight infection, and we may develop new allergies out of nowhere, really. Ultimately, though, if we are chronically producing very high levels of cortisol, the brain doesn't enjoy that. Cortisol is quite damaging for the brain, and the brain will say, enough is enough, I need to protect myself, let's switch off this cortisol production, and it will tell the adrenal glands to start shutting down cortisol production. And then what we may see is people moving into this more severe stage of chronic stress, where cortisol levels are actually quite low. Now, even though this is almost a protective thing, a protective response from the body, trying to protect the brain, there are still symptoms that we can experience when we have chronically low cortisol levels. So for example, fatigue and exhaustion are the two main ones. feeling exhausted, waking up in the mornings, feeling tired, having big dips in the afternoon, maybe needing a nap where we didn't used to need a nap at that time. Memory changes again, and again, the link to the immune system. So we have found a link between people who have chronically low cortisol levels and autoimmune diseases, for example. So when doctors say to us, stress kills, we mean it. If you've got a cortisol level that's too high, you may develop blood pressure problems and diabetes. And conversely, if you've got cortisol levels that are too low over a prolonged period of time, there may be a higher risk for autoimmune diseases and even certain cancers. If we understand where we are in this sort of chronic stress continuum, there are strategies and ways that we can modulate the stress response and regain a kind of normal signaling system again, and learn or teach the body how to respond appropriately to stress. So instead of sending 10 ambulances to a minor cut, we can teach the body that only a plaster is actually needed at this time. But it is important to understand that stress can also really affect a woman's experience of perimenopause and menopause. So in the adrenal glands, cortisol is made from precursor hormones such as pregnenolone and progesterone. So if we're in that first phase of chronic stress, which is churning out the cortisol, stress-wired, just cortisol day in and day out, the adrenal glands are actually using a lot of progesterone to keep sustaining that high cortisol output. Now, we've already established that perimenopause is a time where progesterone levels decline from the ovaries because we're not able to produce enough ripe eggs anymore. So the body would like to get a little bit of progesterone from the adrenal glands, but if you're a stressed woman and you're using up all your progesterone to make cortisol, there's not a lot of progesterone for the body to use from the adrenal glands. So overall, the picture of progesterone deficiency becomes worse or more magnified, and therefore all the symptoms related to progesterone deficiency, such as anxiety, heart palpitations, weight gain, heavy periods, can become a whole lot worse.